Hmm. Okay, it's 5:32. Raja, let's go.
And we go. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Khouri Conversations, tonight in partnership with the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. As regular participants know, at the Khouri Conversations, we only deal with light subjects, and we pride ourselves on the fact that we often end up without any casualties. So welcome again, and first things first, I'd like to start us with a land acknowledgement. As we begin, it's important to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land and territories, known and unknown. We respect Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. As settlers, we recognize that we have an active role in reconciliation. Well, we're here today for a number of reasons. First of all, welcome Professor Mira Sucharov with her recent book, Borders and Belonging, and the many things that she generously reveals about her journey, about her personal life, professional life, and her significant thoughts about Israel, Palestine. Another reason we're here today is rising tensions between the pro-Palestinian, pro-Israel camps here in Canada. We saw that in May, and it didn't look good. We saw tensions rising on university campuses, and we saw all sorts of needless accusation being thrown. We saw people who were standing up for Palestinian rights being accused of being anti-Semitic and Hamas terrorist supporters. So things have been happening, and they are not looking good to those of us who care about understanding, cross-cultural understanding, and sort of peaceful coexistence, and being able to reach a common ground between different communities. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our volunteers, David and Jeff, who have sort of helped us set up the session today. And now I would like to introduce Peter Larson, who will be introducing our guest, Mira Sucharov. And here is Peter's intro. Pardon me 1 second. Peter is the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, a Canadian human rights organization focusing on the Middle East. Before retiring, Peter was the executive vice president of the Public Policy Forum, an NGO based in Ottawa. For the last 10 years, he has taken a particular interest in human rights issues in the Middle East, visiting Israel, Iran, Jordan, Egypt, and the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza. In 2012, he was awarded the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal by the Governor-General of Canada in recognition of his educational work on Canada-Arab relations. I'm Raja Khouri of Khouri Conversations, and over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Raja, and hi to Mira. I get the pleasure of introducing Mira, who probably doesn't need much introduction to many people on the call, but Mira is a professor of political science at Carleton University. She has an MA in political science from the University of Toronto, a PhD from Georgetown University. She not only is a professor, she is an author. She has published several books. We're going to be talking about the most recent of those books tonight. Borders and Belonging, which is available at your local bookstore, or if you're penny pinched, it's also available through the Ottawa Public Library and presumably the Toronto Public Library as well. Mira has also written many articles, op-eds in respectable publications like Haaretz, Globe and Mail, and others, and many of you will have seen her opinion pieces there. She grew up in Winnipeg, but now she lives in Ottawa with her husband and family. So welcome, Mira, and thanks for agreeing to spend a few minutes with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, for hosting me, Peter and Raja. Raja and I were in conversation a few years ago, before the pandemic, certainly, with an Israeli and Palestinian teen, and that was in Toronto, and that was very rewarding, and it was really wonderful to hear from the youth, the next generation. Do you want me to begin with a page of?
Yeah, well, I will ask you to do it, but we've already made this previous arrangement. But I thought a good way to start, your most recent book, you call it a memoir, and it's partly an intimate conversation about a young woman becoming a young girl becoming a young woman, and partly a conversation about your own feelings about Israel. I personally found it a fascinating read. But I was a bit uncomfortable with it. I felt like I had fallen on somebody's private diary that I'd found on a park bench somewhere and wasn't sure I should be really reading it, because there were a lot of personal insights, observations, thoughts that you shared with the public. And that made for me a very interesting and appealing and a little bit uncomfortable reading of the book. But you also had a lot of political insight and thought. And that's the aspect that Raj and I would like to pursue with you today, those more political thoughts. And I thought the best way to maybe start that conversation would be to ask you to read a short section from the prologue of your book that kind of sets the stage pretty well. So that's what we were talking about. And if you're prepared to do that, Mira, I think that would be terrific.
Great, will do. From the prologue. Sorry, Mira, the email says. This is 2015. The email says, I need to pull out of the group. My husband doesn't want you in our home. I swallow hard. The email is from a woman I know from the local Jewish community. Years ago, we had spent an afternoon together in her tidy suburban home, surrounded by dress-up clothes and dollhouses as our daughters played noisily. A few weeks earlier, I had created a bar and bat mitzvah project group for Jewish youth around town. My daughter's bat mitzvah was coming up, and I wanted to shore up the Ottawa cohort, create a sense of community, encourage families to see how this personal milestone could be mobilized to pursue a smattering of social justice. We, the parents, had spent a week over email coordinating the timing and locations and guest list and program and menu. Rotating hosts would supply the space and the refreshments, and I promised to guide the kids in designing a social justice campaign on a topic of their choice. We'd learned how to identify wrongs that needed righting. I figured I'd start with something simple, a fictional scenario about a jelly bean factory in crisis, maybe. I'd ask the kids to consider why the factory had suddenly run out of jelly beans. What might the causes and remedies be? We would talk about justice. We'd think about individuals and structures and systems. The workers' conditions, the children who needed the jelly beans, the price of sugar, the town's water supply. Once we identified causes and solutions, we would consider how to leverage social media to help repair the world. We would learn about Maimonides' ethical ladder of charity, and I would try my best, I promised myself, to keep my own politics out of it, mostly anyway. I'd encourage the kids to come to their own conclusions, and at the end of the evening, we would eat ice cream and drink hot cocoa. Hot chocolate for hot issues, I called it. I continue reading the woman's email. My husband says you support a group calling for the destruction of Israel and the Jewish people. My mind spins. Which group is her husband thinking of? It can't be the local Jewish community boards I've sat on. Those are each squarely mainstream, though I've admittedly tried to push their boundaries. Maybe it's the American Jewish organization I'm on the board of, and for which I fundraise and travel to New York once a year for meetings. For that group, I've been working to get a progressive slate elected to the World Zionist Organization. The group is liberal, certainly, but it's definitely Zionist, so it can't be that one. And would he even know about it? Would he, the husband, even know about it? Or maybe it's the academic group I'm part of, the one that tries to oppose the occupation and oppose attempts at boycotting Israeli academia. That one is also liberal, but also within the Zionist consensus. And it's against BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, after all. So with my cheeks burning, I ask her, which group would that be? I wait half an hour, irritated and restless, before a reply arrives in my inbox. The Palestinian people in general. And then she links to an article, an op-ed I had recently published. My editor at the Globe and Mail had titled it, "The Problem with Picking Sides in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict." In that piece, I was trying to lay out what I saw as a balanced approach for my Canadian readers. A few years later, it's true, I would come to question even that sort of approach. I would come to advance a more justice-forward, elbows-out position, clearly not the direction her husband would want, but my stance is measured in this Globe and Mail piece she sent me. Measured is clearly not good enough for them. As an Israeli supporter, she writes, there is only one side. I close my email program and with teeth clenched, open a Facebook window. Wow, a new personal low for internal Jewish communal relations, I write as I describe what happened with the incident scrubbed of names. Reactions start to roll in. You'd be invited into my house and asked to stay for dinner. Don't be afraid to keep talking. Eventually they will hear you. I am deeply ashamed of my Jewish community. Time for this woman to stand up for herself. I'm grateful for the solidarity and I click like. A few minutes later, a friendly acquaintance calls about some other matter. I fill her in on what I've been going through today, but I don't get the reaction I'm hoping for. If you're going to put yourself out there, you're going to get burned, she says. And for the rest of the day, all I have is my righteous indignation and a splitting headache. How did I come to be perceived by those who seemingly liked me enough to chat every day at pickup time outside of the JCC preschool and to smile across the room at baby music classes and to invite me to their home for play dates as an enemy of the Jews? And some years later, how did I come to not even know what I believed? How did my political and ethical rudder, once so firm and certain, start to warp from the waters of communal pressures coming at me from all directions? When it comes to the topic of Israel, a subject on which I was suckled and weaned during 7 years of Jewish day school, a decade at Hebrew summer camp, and 3 years of living in the country, soaking up the atmosphere and sometimes dreaming about moving there myself. When it comes to Israel, a subject on which I've claimed to be a scholar specialist for all of my adult life and about which I've never hesitated in speaking up and speaking out, I guess I should have known that anything is possible.
Thank you, Mira. And to our participants, Peter and I are going to engage in a conversation with Mira now, after which we will be responding to as many of your questions as possible. Please put your questions in the Q&A and we will hopefully get to most of them eventually. Mira, I can't think of a better story to start your book than the one that you told. It speaks volumes. It speaks volume of the sort of deep polarization that surrounds the issue of Israel, Palestine, and how it has gotten to a point that if someone speaks up for Palestinian rights, they are seen by some as anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. They want to destroy Israel and so on. I recall a story of my own. A friend, an Israeli friend who was originally from Toronto, went and lived in Israel, came back here years later, and she asked the question, when did Zionism replace Judaism as the religion of the Jewish community? How do you feel about that question? How would you react to that question? And I would add to it, why is it that there's an Israeli flag in almost every synagogue?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's a phenomenon that I myself recount being swept up in, particularly when I was 18 and when I went to I'd gone to Hebrew immersion summer camp all for my whole childhood and most of my teenage years. And then I switched to a labor Zionist camp where the Zionism was a little bit more explicit. in the Hebrew summer camp, it was implicit. It was just the air we breathed. But in the labor Zionist summer camp, when I was 18 and I was a counselor, we were delving into Zionist philosophy. There was a lot of talk about making aliyah, which is the Hebrew word for immigrating to Israel as a Jew. And I was very aware that there seemed in that context, because it wasn't a religious Zionist camp. Of course, there were a lot of those, the religious settlers and those. It was much more of a secular Zionism. And we were very comfortable. And I think we even embraced the idea that Zionism was in some ways replacing more conventional Jewish spirituality. We didn't pray at that camp. We didn't say grace after meals. We sang, in some senses, secular socialist labor songs, whether Jewish or Zionist inflected or not. And to me, it was a very comfortable place to be as a late teen in my early 20s. And it felt liberating to not be under the sway of a patriarchal God, let's say. And it felt like we were agents of our own fate. And it felt, I guess, like many of the liberatory movements that had preceded us. Now, when I was, another scene I recount in the book is when I'm at university and feeling very Zionist, though as a progressive Zionist, a liberal Zionist, I considered myself for sure. There's a conversation I have with a graduate student who I've become very close to at this point in my studies, and he starts challenging me on the notion of nationalism. What do you mean, Mira? Nationalism's a good thing. Look at all the crimes that have been committed in the name of nationalism. And so he starts getting me thinking a little bit about maybe the raw underbelly or the seedy underside of what any sort of ethnic nationalism can be.
Can I just pick up on that summer camp? I was quite struck. There was a survey that came out by Environics not too long ago about Canadian Jews, and it showed that Canadian Jews, compared to their American counterparts, go to Jewish summer camp more, go to Israel more, spend more time in Israel, and generally have a stronger attachment to Israel than their American counterparts. In your book, you talked about the summer camp, and a lot of the aspects of the summer camp reflected mine. I went to non-Jewish summer camp, just I'll call it ordinary summer camp. We had a lot of the same fun experiences that you had. But one particular thing really struck me, and you talked about a game that you played where and correct me if I haven't got this quite right, but I did. Game that you played where you campers were invited to play the role of inmates in a concentration camp or in some kind of gulag, and you were surrounded by mean guards. It was all play acting, surrounded by mean guards who in some cases were actually Israeli counselors who came to the camp. And your role as young kids was to try to escape to Israel. And that really set me back a bit. I said, that must be a very formative experience for young kids and lead them to be scared and see Israel as the only possible way to be safe. And I wondered, what did you think about it at the time? And what do you think about it now?
Yes, absolutely. There's the main program we played was embodying Soviet Jewry refuseniks. And that program had been in place since, I believe, the 70s. And then I was doing it in the 80s. And we were 14. So we were at a very delicate age of being between children and emerging teens, young adults. But then it was very popular. So our counselors the next year created more of a Holocaust version, which is sort of what you're describing. And yes, absolutely. The message was that Israel was the salvation, and escaping to Israel was the way of winning the game and ending the game successfully. And those who didn't escape to Israel had sort of lost the game, but then we all united in the dining hall for cookies and Israeli dancing. And absolutely the message was that Zionism was us. Well, there were two messages. They embodied what I think is the basic Zionist impulse, a combination of push and pull factors. So in one sense, we were taught that Jews were pushed to Israel out from persecution, so out of the ashes. And that's the push, and that's, I think, historically correct for many arrivals to Israel. And there's another aspect to it, not a conflicting explanation, but just a parallel aspect, that many Jews were drawn to Israel for the pull factors of sense of collective self-actualization or collective normalization, becoming a nation like all others, which meant in the international system that we live in, having a state, having a national sovereign expression. And we were really taught both those things. We were taught that Israel was a safe haven. And I think even more than that, we were taught that Israel was a place of fun and vitality and learning Israeli songs and Israeli pop songs and speaking Hebrew, so that by the time I lived in Israel in my 20s as an overseas student, I could engage seamlessly in the society and feel like I could contribute to it.
Is that why you say in your book that Israel seduced you?
Yes, it was very, very intoxicating for me to be able to enter a society where I spoke the language in a diaspora way, but a decent level of fluency at the time. And then my Hebrew improved, and feel that everyone was Jewish. Of course, not everyone in Israel is Jewish. And that's a very important thing to remember, and something I've been exploring a lot more in my recent research, that 20% of Israel's citizens are Palestinian. And of course, there are the many, many Palestinians under occupation in the West Bank and under siege in Gaza. But the sense that Hebrew was a living language and there were cultural touchstones, and the holidays, the statutory holidays went according to the Jewish calendar. You'll hear a lot of this is a typical Zionist and Jewish, Canadian and North American Jewish reaction to Israel. But I felt very at home. I felt very at home, and not only in a comfortable way, but in an exciting way, the sort of frisson of the pace of Israel, the culture of Israelis. It's a very candid culture. There's books on this. Sociolinguists have written books on Israeli speaking style and how that reflects something about the culture. And I could try on a little bit of a different personality there, a little bit of a different identity, yet it was an identity that spoke to my core as well.
Hence the conflict that you came across when that culture also meant what it meant to Palestinians and what it meant in terms of occupation. Can you bring us into your head, your mental space, struggling with these things?
Well, in my early 20s, at the time, it was very clear to me that the occupation was fundamentally wrong. I never doubted that for a minute, though I talk about this in the book as well. I had to find a scholarly voice and an analytical voice, a political voice that didn't rely on pat cliches. And I remember at one point in a paper I wrote for a course at the Hebrew University, I said the Palestinians are being used as pawns. And the TA, the teaching assistant, circled that in red, and he said, "What do you mean? Like, explain." And I realized I couldn't. I didn't have an actual opinion about that. I just heard the phrase and I was tossing that in. So that's part of the journey, is to say, well, what do I really think, and who are the pawns and who are the players? And so I always thought that the occupation was wrong, but what I didn't think as much about was 1948. So in other words, I was very common for progressive Zionists to focus on 1967 as the key benchmark milestone date for when things turned bad, for when the occupation began. And now in the recent years, and I talk about this in the book as well, I have been thinking a lot more about what it means for refugees, for why are the Gazans there living as they do. The majority of people in Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza, were refugees from Israel proper, so to speak, or Palestine at the time that became Israel during the 47 to 49 era. So as it was shifting from the Palestine Mandate to the state of Israel in 1948. And there's another scene in the book where I talk about encountering this debate between 1948 and 1967, back when I was in graduate school with a fellow student who was an Arab American student. And I wasn't yet ready to hear that yet. And I'm very defensive in that conversation. And we're in the hallway of our building at Georgetown. And it's a very uncomfortable conversation because we'd been buddies and we'd been pals, and he was a lot of fun and we had a lot of laughs. But the conversation stayed with me, and that those are important moments. one's outlook doesn't always immediately change, but to have conversations that linger and percolate, and then keeping studying, keeping thinking, keeping learning, and perspectives can and do often evolve.
Yeah, I mean, that's an astute observation, and I can tell from my own dialogue with progressive Jews is that they start in '67, and that's a big gap, because I'm still in 1948, because it hasn't been acknowledged, it hasn't been atoned for, it hasn't been recognized by Israel, and all of those things. Peter, sorry, I'm
Okay.
hogging the conversation here. I'll shut up now.
No problem. I'm going to go right into something that's a bit delicate, but I know that you're a very brave woman, and excuse me if I don't express this very well, but to a lot of non-Jews, a lot of us non-Jews, who know progressive Jews who are very sincerely committed to human rights of all kinds, their willingness to give what appears to us to be a pass to Israel, who know that Israel is illiberal in many ways, both not only with respect to the occupation, but also internally in terms of their Jews have rights that others don't have, and so on. It appears to us a conundrum, and it's easily dismissed as, you've probably heard this phrase, PEP, Progressive Except Palestine, which is kind of a semi-slur, or hypocrite. I don't think you're hypocritical, and I struggle with trying to understand how someone who has a genuine attachment to liberal democratic values can at the same time feel that there's some reasons that make it acceptable in the case of Israel. So help me with that a bit. Hope I expressed it okay.
Now, I'm sorry, my eyes glanced to one of the questions. So can you just say the last sentence again?
Sure. I mean, yeah. How
the core of the question, aside from the observation about the tensions between Jews being progressive on some issues and not on all.
Yeah, well, that is the core. I mean, how do you see that, and how do you help us interpret it without just being dismissive in terms of saying, well, it's hypocritical or whatever? I know smart people who hold those views, and I'm interested in your take on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't consider myself PEP, Progressive Except for Palestine, because I do advocate and believe that full equality needs to rain down on that land, including a just solution for refugees, which would probably involve significant return, or at least the right of return granted to refugees. So I don't, and I see a lot of the inequalities, inequities in Israeli society, but so I wasn't sure if you were directing that at me or me as an analyst of Canadian Jews. In many ways I am. So in the memoir, I'm both myself writing about my particular journey, and I'm here also as an analyst of the broader phenomenon. And I think the broader phenomenon, I mean, I can tell you what they would say. Is that what you want me to do, like kind of role play what they might say back to you? I mean, whatever.
I'm just trying to probe this a little bit. I think tell me how I think you said that you evolved over time. So maybe I can talk about your evolution. I mean, that's a better way to do it, rather than have you speak for other people.
My evolution, I mean, I think before I evolved to where I am now, I probably simply focused less on Israel's laws and practices with regard to Palestinian citizens of Israel. And I looked at it as an occupation issue that would and could be solved by a state in the West Bank and Gaza with safe access between the two. And so I was very much in the Oslo paradigm. I've just seen, my mom asked me to watch the film Oslo, which I did. And it was, I don't know, I'd love to talk about that. We should have a whole other session on the film, and which of course came from a play, and my dissertation research rests on that. So I'd interviewed those folks, and yes, Uri Savir is a bit brash, and he lit up a cigar in our interview, very, 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 very small interview room but I didn't see the leather jacket on him. But there was a sense of hope that it could be solved through those two states, though but as we know, they deferred the toughest issues till later. So I was very much in that Oslo paradigm, that just not looking as much at the inequities between Israeli citizens and Palestinian citizens, and thinking that the refugee issue could be solved in a two-state framework. So I think that's what you'll hear from Jews fellow Jews, Jewish Zionists, who don't want to contend with the inequality that you're thinking about quite to that degree. Yeah.
Okay. Raja?
You write about your journey on BDS. Of course, BDS being the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that has been labeled anti-Semitic, regrettably, even by progressive Jewish organizations. I mean, I can understand people being opposed to BDS, but to label it anti-Semitic, that's a different dimension. Share with our viewers who haven't read your book some of your journey on BDS and where do you sit today? Because it continues to be one of those, highly controversial, debated, and polarizing issues out there.
The first time I heard about BDS was, I think, before it had coalesced, I think before the 2005 official call, and we didn't talk about it yet in those letters, the three letters B, D, and S together, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And there were just some early calls for academic boycotts in Ontario. Maybe one of the unions had called for an academic boycott, and the media, a Canadian news outlet, had phoned me as an expert on Israel-Palestine and a professor in Canada for a reaction. And it was, again, very early on, and I hadn't given these tactics much thought at all, nor had I really thought about the goals very deeply, the three pillars that then emerged on the BDS website, for example. And I had one word to describe it in the phone call with the reporter: despicable. And I really think about that word a lot. And I really think that my reaction was based on a sense that cutting off academic links was fundamentally distasteful and went against all the values that I stand for as a scholar. Now, that's the academic boycott. I mean, there's multiple aspects to it. There's sanctions, which wouldn't happen by anyone here. That would happen at the government level. There's divestment initiatives, divesting from companies that enable the occupation. And there's consumer boycott: which hummus do you buy, which wine do you buy? So there's a lot of different elements. The one that gets talked about probably most of all in my circles, and maybe in yours too, is the academic one, and the cultural, relatedly, the cultural boycott. And since then, I have a slightly different view of it. And at this point, I don't identify as a BDS supporter myself, but I no longer belong to groups, and I did belong to groups that actively oppose BDS. So I try to walk a very fine line in the middle, sort of atop the mound of activism and counter-activism that represents the BDS debate. And I'm actually writing a chapter on that right now for an edited volume about teaching about BDS. And I'm really wondering about how various colleagues go about it, because if you're really opposed to academic boycotts on principle, if you think that's a really unprincipled thing to do, no matter in what political context, how do you teach about both sides neutrally? Similarly, if you're really for BDS, how do you teach about both sides equally if you feel it's a matter of principle? So I don't mean that people who grow up in one ethnic community can't teach about both sides, but I mean if you feel very strongly about the principle. So I find it a very interesting case study because it is about partly about competing or contested principles, or at least how they're viewed. But really, I no longer want to stand in the way of peaceful, nonviolent protest, even if I have some qualms about some of the tactics. That's on the tactics. On the goals, and this is where I think you'll hear more of the anti-Semitic accusation, and I don't agree with it, but I know why they're saying it, because they think that full refugee return spells the end of Israel, spells the destruction of Israel. And then they'll use, you'll hear opponents say, if they're calling a BDS supporter anti-Semitic, they're probably also saying it's because you, proverbial anti-BDS supporter, believe in destroying Israel. So then it really is a question about refugee return and what that means. And that is an important conversation that we should have.
Yeah, I feel that sometimes people who, it doesn't happen very often, but when people, serious, thoughtful people do accuse me of anti-Semitism, it's not because they think that I subjectively don't like Jews or whatever, but that by taking some of the positions I'm taking, I am objectively creating a situation of danger for Jews. It's more of that latter thought around the right of return, particularly, that people would feel substantively that I'm not, I don't understand sufficiently the Jewish predicament, and I'm willing to take a risk that I wouldn't do if I were, I guess if I were Jewish or I was sufficiently attentive to Jewish needs.
I think there's 2 points there I'd like to unpack a little bit, and I think that's an important point. One is the policy view of BDS, the pillar. One of the pillars is refugee return, and does that mean the end of the Jewish state? So that's a policy debate. The next part of that is the general sense of criticizing Israel. And if you're a student on campus or a high school student and people around you are criticizing Israel harshly, saying that Zionism is racist, saying that Zionism intrinsically gives rise to inequality, thinking that the Israeli flag is intrinsically evil or bad, that can lead to, it certainly can, and I'm making an empirical observation here, lead to a sense of discomfort by mainstream Jewish students who have been raised to believe that Israel is a core function of their identity. And I mean, in many ways, I'm quite, I guess I would call this intellectual privilege or professional privilege, because I can operate a bit above that fray. First of all, I'm older. I'm not a student, an undergrad. I'm not a high schooler, but I'm also in a position of being a so-called expert of the field. I'm a professor of the field. So I can move into professor mode and say, well, here's how things are, let me talk about it. But if you're a student who's not a professional policy analyst, you don't have those, they don't have those tools. And so it can feel very, and I don't mean tools to advocate for Israel, because those tools are being given out. I mean tools to have really deep, thoughtful, reasoned analysis and conversation, like the conversations that Raja runs here. And that can be a challenge. And I do think that needs to be acknowledged.
Yeah, but I mean, when you convince students, young Jews, that BDS is anti-Semitic, and they go to campus and they find a table promoting BDS, and they feel they're threatened by it, and that it's because they've been told it's anti-Semitic. I mean, where do you go with that? I mean, you know, the people who are pro-BDS, likely students, are passionate about Palestine and Palestinian rights. They're not intending to attack Jews, but they are passionate about Palestinian rights.
And may not have very, very deep knowledge about it either. And that's also true.
Yeah, and then you end up with these, I mean, you work in a campus, you end up with these tensions on campus that escalate and become problematic. I mean, tell us about your experience as a prof.
Well, in the classroom, it's normally quite fine and even very good. There's been 1 or 2 semesters that have been very challenging. I write about those in the book, of course. Any problems I've ever had in my life, they're in the book, so go and read it. By the way, I do have to say one thing about the personal, and Peter said, we're not going to talk about the personal parts of the book, we're only going to talk about the political. Of course, need I say that the personal is political by risk of talking in mid to late 20th century slogans, feminist slogans. But the book is an attempt to show how we can't have our personal journeys are implicated in our politics, and our politics shape our personal journeys, and our personal journeys shape our politics. So in my case, just about the book, that it's really about a sense of home and belonging, politically, spatially, family-wise, personal-wise. So just on that. So in the courses, there have been times where it's been tough. And I've revised some of my teaching materials. I created an edited volume, Social Justice in Israel, Palestine, to bring thinkers and writers and activists together on ththese most sensitive issues, pro-BDS, anti-BDS, somewhere in the middle, not necessarily the BDS, but there are other pieces that are somewhere in the middle on various issues, and they're speaking to each other and they're engaging each other, because I want students to grapple with these questions and grapple with these debates directly. And I don't want to be arguing with them as a debating partner. That's not my role. So that's what I want to make sure they're doing. Yeah, I mean, I think the solution to the scenario you mentioned, where there's a BDS table and Jewish students arrive. Some of the BDS activists may be Jewish too, of course.
Sure.
And I know you know that. Yeah. But your mainstream Jewish student arrives on campus, sees a BDS table, feels threatened. I think what we need to be doing more of is having more and more conversations with the following question: how can Palestinian rights and Jewish collective rights be assured? And I've created a small and growing organization that right now is only on Facebook, but for 5 hours it didn't exist the other day, right? Because Facebook was down. So we want to bring it out into the streets one of these days, but it's called Drachim, meaning ways, from my favorite Shlomo Artzi album, Israeli rock star, pop star in the 70s, still performs now. And it's called Drachim, Ways. And it's about how to envision a polity that elevates Palestinian Arabic culture alongside Jewish Hebrew culture, with refugee return, with new political arrangements, so that it's, we want to break the view that you articulated that some people hold, that advocating for Palestinian rights means diminishing Jewish collective rights, and vice versa, of course. Well, vice versa is what's happening right now in practice in Israel, Palestine. And so we want to really start raising different kinds of questions.
Raja, I noticed that we have quite a few questions here. I have about 10 of my own, but I see that we have other people on, and maybe you should
only 10, Peter. I have about 50 more to go, and continue this conversation all evening with you, Mira. I felt envious of your friend, was it Matt? I think you talk about in the book that you used to have these chats with all the time. I feel like I want to be Matt for a while and continue this chat. But yeah, Peter is right. We have plenty of questions. You want to pick something for us, Peter, to start with?
I was hoping that you would here, but let me see.
Okay, I have one.
Okay, please do. I'll look through the list while you're talking about the first one. Yeah.
All right. Okay. And this gentleman said that I should feel free to attribute this to him. It's Rabbi David Mevaser. I know I'm butchering the pronunciation here. He says there are organizations would like to use the word anti-Semitism in order to brand themselves, but they are not truly progressive. Sorry, the word progressive. If they choose to oppose BDS on the false basis of it being anti-Semitic. So I guess we're talking here about sort of degrees of progressiveness, because if you look at progressive American organizations, and this was part of the topic that we're supposed to talk about today, is the difference between the Jewish community here and the one in the United States, which tends to be a lot more liberal, progressive, and sort of open-minded. So can you talk about this a little bit?
Sure. Well, Canadian Jews immigrated to Canada about a generation later than American Jews immigrated to the US. Australia's even one generation later than Canada. So it's not surprising that Jews in these respective places are more Zionist, more higher levels of Jewish literacy, all the things that Peter said earlier on, more likely to send kids to Jewish day school, learn Hebrew, Jewish summer camp, visiting Israel. Reform Judaism is the biggest denomination in the US, but not in Canada. Conservative Judaism is a bigger denomination in Canada. So there is so in some ways that has led to, I don't know if I would call it a closed-mindedness or just a real connectivity to Israel. So then the question is, well, what do we do with that connection, and how do we navigate the conversations to talk about Jewish safety, Jewish cultural connection, Jewish cultural rights, and Palestinian rights. So I mean, I'm very, in a sense, optimistic about shaping conversation. I'm probably more optimistic about shaping conversations in the diaspora than I am about getting things done in Israel-Palestine, but I know what I think needs to be done. And yeah, so Rabbi Mevaser, and you actually did say his name right, as far as I know it to be, he's saying, yes, that many groups call themselves progressive, but progressive doesn't mean the same thing to every group. And the progressive is a broad part. It's not a single point on a political spectrum, I would say.
I wish we had enough time to talk about IRA within this context, but we won't. That's a different session for a different day. Peter?
Mira, we've heard, there's another question been raised. We've heard in the last couple of years, I've been brought aware of this term settler colonialism, both in Canada and also with respect to Israel. And I wonder if you accept, you're asked if you accept that framework or not, and if so, yes, and if not, why not? With respect to Israel, I'm referring.
Someone just asked me to write the group Drachim, so I'm going to mention that.
Okay.
Right, the spelling. Yeah, so settler colonialism is another chapter we have in the book that I co-edited, where people talk about, scholars are debating whether it's the best label or not the best label to use for Israel-Palestine. I think in Canada it is widely accepted as an appropriate label. Then again,
Appropriate label for Canada.
For Canada.
Yeah.
Then again, Jews, and I mean, let's say, I mean, we could talk about Raja's respective history and family journey getting here, my respective family journey getting here, and Peter's respective family journey getting here. And we could say, well, are we all equally settler? I mean, to an Indigenous person, we are, but there are nuances, right? I would say as well. But in the Israel-Palestine case, the reason it's become such a flashpoint and such a debate is because we are in a post-colonial moment. I mean, it didn't just start, but there's a more and more an awareness that colonization against the will of the people being colonized is wrong, and that people deserve to have the right to channel their own fate and not be under the thumb of a power an external power. And Israelis don't want to see themselves as intrinsically controlling another people. They would, sort of right-wing Israelis don't even like the term occupation. They would say it's a disputed territory, it's administered territory, it was conquered during war. Jordan washed its hands of the territory in the late 80s. There's no partner for peace. You'll hear right-wing Israelis say there's no one to talk to. So you'll have that idea. More on the progressive Zionist wing, there will be those who say the occupation has to end, but as soon as it ends, Israel will no longer intrinsically be a settler colonial state, because Israel will be a democracy within its rightful borders and can go on just like any democracy that has a majority ethnicity and a minority ethnicity. So the reason it's such a contested term is because it sounds very evil, it sounds very wrong. And as soon as you slap a term or apply a term to a case, then it implies that something has to change and that action has to be taken. As soon as you apply a negative term like settler colonialism, it implies that action has to be taken to roll it back. And I mean, I'm not opposed to using that term, but I like to be aware of the resonances it holds. And so then we say, well, what has to change? And what are the relationships? And what are the policies that are contributing to inequality between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, either whether they're citizens or whether they're under occupation or under Gaza siege? So it can be useful to get a conversation going, but as with many labels, we can't stop with the label.
Thank you.
There are a number of questions here about the conflation of, Palestinian activism with anti-Semitism, and I've heard stories, especially on campuses, where people who are advocating for Palestinian rights, and they're not Palestinian themselves, they're approaching it from a sort of a human rights perspective, as you know, especially since the May events, many in the left, the Black Lives Matter and the pro-Indigenous and movements sort of adopting the Palestinian cause, and they were hit by accusations of, anti-Semitism, and they were shocked. They were saying, how I wasn't, I had no idea. I'm just speaking on behalf of Palestinian rights. So to people like that, can you offer advice? Like, how can you talk about Palestinian rights without being labeled anti-Semitic, which is a huge label, and it's something we're all clearly against, and it shouldn't be used lightly.
It is a real predicament for Palestinian activism, and we've seen it recently in the Toronto District School Board, where speakers have come in and said, for example, "Free Palestine." And that we could have a whole session on that phrase and unpacking it and what it means. And what it means in the mouth of a speaker isn't necessarily what it means in the ear of all listeners. And I think, I've written about that. I did write a piece when the phrase came into the news and resulted in a prominent scholar writer being released from a prominent broadcast position. And I'd written at the time that, it's not necessarily, now, in retrospect, it's not that I disagree with what I wrote, but in retrospect, it's not necessarily for me to choose the slogans or adapt or revise the slogans of activist groups seeking liberation. However, I did make a friendly suggestion that perhaps instead of saying Palestine should be free, one might say Palestinians should be free. And then we start focusing the issue on people and people's lives. And what does it mean to be a Palestinian in Gaza? What does it mean to be a Palestinian citizen of Israel? What does it mean to be a Palestinian refugee elsewhere outside of any of those territories and an occupied Palestinian in the West Bank? What does it mean to live in area A, B, or C? Where is the deficit of equality to inequality, freedom to lack of freedom? And the deficit will look a little bit different for each group, but it's there. And how do we fix that? And what does it look like to fix it? Because I think what's missing and what people are fearing and feeling traumatized by is a lack of compassion for everyone there. And what we need to increase is really, if we lead by compassion and we talk about equality, we talk about positive things, well, freedom is a positive thing, then we're getting somewhere.
Peter?
A number of people have asked a question, Mira, generally about your recommendations on how to move this discussion forward. Most of them focused on how to move it forward within the Canadian Jewish community, but I also feel that the flip side also is important. So how can serious people who believe in human rights and democracy nudge this conversation forward in Canada, in your opinion?
I think a person-centered discourse. I was going to say human rights, but obviously that's what human rights are. They're rights for human beings. But I just wanted to use a different phrase because even the term human rights sticks in the craw of some people who think that it means something, which it does, but that it means the human rights of some and not the human rights of others, but it needs to mean the human rights of everyone, right? So a person-centered discourse, looking together at what equality would look like for everyone. What are the legitimate fears that every individual or group has, and how can those fears be addressed without impinging on the freedom and democratic rights of others, both individually and collectively? So that's where I differ from some Palestine solidarity activists who have a purely, let's say, liberal individual view, who want a state without collective rights. And I'm more Canadian in that way. I'm more of a Canadian sensibility where we really uphold collective language rights. Obviously French and English, and now Indigenous languages are being elevated more, very, very, very slowly, but we're trying to remember and recall the need for cultural promotion of all our official languages, and as well cultural promotion in a multicultural sense of newer arrivals to Canada. And so if we think of it in positive, and I know that multiculturalism hasn't been the panacea and hasn't worked out to everything it's cracked up to be, but the principle, I think, is a good one. And so if we think about so it's interesting because what we're the era we're in right now has a lot of anti-racism, anti-oppression, and those are the terms we're using a lot lately. I do think we need, perhaps in the Israel-Palestine case, to increase and add in the positive terms. What are we looking for? And I find equality is a great place to start.
I think you probably have gotten, if not some pushback, some questions about why you're talking to people like the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine or Khouri Conversations, and I get a little bit of pushback on why am I having some conversation with you. I think this is the bridge that needs to be done. I think serious conversations are important. I have a set of principles I work to. I'm sure we all do as well. And I think when I look at some of the comments that have come in, they're only visible to you, Mira and Raja and myself, but some of them are I think I'll say they're fairly simplistic. I mean, they as if there's one line answer that everybody can agree to, and it's definitely not the case. So we're moving towards the end. I'm going to turn the final conclusion over to Raja to thank you and maybe give you the last word, but it's been a pleasure for me to participate in this conversation, and thank you so much for exposing yourself. And I encourage everyone to get the book either at the bookstore or pick it up at the public library, because there's lots more in there to be unpacked. So thank you very much, Mira.
Thank you.
I'm going to cheat. I'm not going to close. I'm going to ask one more question. And my clock is slow, so I'm 4 minutes behind. The question that I just saw caught my eye. It's about Zionism, and in talking to some Jewish colleagues, they say that Zionism essentially is a movement for self-determination. I remember the first time I heard that, and that was a seminal moment for me because it's something I'd never heard before. Of course, growing up Palestinian in Lebanon, Zionism is a dirty word. I mean, it's what destroyed Palestinian society. It's all of those bad things, and everything bad that happened to Palestinians was because of Zionism. Peter Beinart, of course, last summer he wrote his Yavne piece talking about Zionism evolving and becoming a more open and inclusive movement. That yes, it does support, provides security for Jews, but not at the expense of Palestinians, and that everybody can live in equality. Do you think there is room for Zionism to evolve? I mean, thinking of it only as a self-determination movement is too narrow. It doesn't take into account the actual impact of Zionism. But for moving forward, is Zionism potentially open to evolution to become more inclusive?
Well, it depends on whether we're talking about Zionism as a sense of diaspora emotional attachment to Israel, or as a sense of an historical political program that created the state of Israel, which now exists. Or a third aspect to Zionism is what I think you're talking about, and that is the governance structure that Zionism, as it has existed since Israel was founded, has given rise to. And that is that governance structure and those sets of policies, the macro policies, the structures, the systems, those have to be revisited. And it will be a very different looking Zionism if it is revisited. And so, I mean, Peter Beinart has chosen not to do away with the Zionist label, but he might wish to. I mean, it's almost a bit irrelevant given the policies and structures he now advocates, including refugee return. So I'm a little less, I use the term a little bit less now because I think it confuses people. And I say instead of whether one is a Zionist or not a Zionist, really the question is, what kind of political vision do you have for that land and for those people? So again, a person-centered view with policies, instructions, and systems put in place to preserve humanity and cultural flourishing.
Okay, well, we shall have you again in conversation, Mira. There are a million other things we'd like to talk to you about. A couple of announcements. Khouri Conversation will be hosting next month a conversation with Human Rights Watch to ask them about the use of the label apartheid and applying it to Israel and Palestine, Israel proper, the entire area. A very controversial report that they wrote, but we would be discussing it so that people will have the opportunity to both, challenge the findings, but also be challenged by them. Peter, did you want to announce any upcoming events for your organization?
Yes, I will. What I will do is I will send out an email to everybody afterwards with some information. Our next, OFIP's next webinar is on incarceration of Palestinian children and their how they're being handled by the Israeli justice system. And there's a progressive Jewish woman from Jerusalem, as well as a Palestinian woman from Jerusalem, who are going to be talking about various aspects of this. And that's on October 16th. But I will send the details in a follow-up email. Also, I see that David Mivaser has suggested, and I will do this as well, that we provide a link to that Drachim Facebook page that Mira referenced as well. So with that, I'm thrilled to have been a part of this. Thank you to both of you. And maybe Mira, the last word to you. So.
Thank you both for a very rich conversation. I really appreciated the questions and I appreciated everyone coming. It's a great turnout and I like everyone else's questions and I'm looking forward to seeing who is here because on a webinar, I can't see you. So Peter's gonna tell me and then that'll be nice.
And another conversation without casualties.
Indeed. There are 160
160
people were on the call today. So
we had 180
very good.
actually at one point. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.